By this point, I'm starting to think that game devs are in agreement with GPU manufacturers, probably putting some invisible bloat in their games just to tank frame rate and sell newer GPU. Otherwise, I can't explain everything. Graphics in games reached its peak in about 2015 to 2016. I can't imagine a game more complex than Cyberpunk 2077 to run, yet somehow every next new released game, regardless of developer genre series, raises the bar for requirement hardware. Someone should investigate this family-friendly show. So anyway, this is a comment on one of my videos, and I've selected it because I could have chose 100, 1,000 other comments I've seen that encapsulate the same feeling. They have making basically the same statement, but I felt that this one comment, first of all, is recent. This happened, I think, about a week ago on my channel. And also, it's, I think, really captures the whole feeling and mindset behind this type of comment. So this is definitely a widespread feeling I'm seeing expressed by my viewers. So I thought, how about I give some response to this? What do I think about that? So let's take this piece by piece, break it down, and I'll give kind of the response. So by this point, I'm starting to think that devs are in agreement with GPU manufacturers. I mean, if you stop there and don't go to the probably putting some invisible bloat in their games, let's stop there. Are game developers in agreement with GPU manufacturers? And the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, not every game and not every game developer, but are game developers in agreements with GPU manufacturers? Well, I mean, I think that's established beyond a shadow of a doubt. There are definitely games that have, the Nvidia logo on their splash screen and have some deals with Nvidia. And there's games with the AMD logo on their splash screen and have some deals with AMD. Oftentimes there's like a cross-brand marketing thing, right? So it's like, there's some kind of marketing synergy. A lot of times if you buy a new graphics card, you might get a game bundle deal with that. And those games, in turn, oftentimes feature heavily the technologies being pushed by the GPU manufacturer that's sponsoring that game. So, for example, we'll see games like Black Myth Wukong, which has a full RT kind of a path tracing mode that I'm pretty sure was implemented with the help of Nvidia engineers to implement that path tracing mode. We also see things like that in like Alan Wake 2 with that full RT mode, where again, I think there's assistance from Nvidia engineers to do that. And Cyberpunk 2077's path tracing mode, those are examples of what I'm talking about there. And I think that there is a deal there for some like cross-brand promotion, right? There's marketing synergy on that. Nvidia gets to show off a cool new game that features their technologies that happen to be technologies their GPUs are better at than the competition. And that only their newer GPUs are able to do well at. And then the game developer gets help, implementing cutting-edge technology into their game. And also, they get that benefit from Nvidia is going to do stuff to promote their technology in this game and advertise that. There's marketing behind that. And the game is mentioned in that marketing. So there's that, synergy behind the marketing between the game and the technology and the GPU manufacturer, and vice versa. If the game is getting good press and good marketing and features this brand, the GPU brand's technology, that reflects well on the GPU brand, and right? So that's kind of the idea. There's this synergistic marketing agreements, game bundle deals. I'm not privy to any information on whether there is or how much money exchanges hands in those things, but I'm sure there's at least engineering help and support in exchange for bundle deals and whatnot. And anyway, so I don't know all the details behind it, but I don't think there's any secret that there are agreements between game developers and GPU manufacturers, and it's not just Nvidia. I mean, you see games that are like AMD sponsored. There was a big thing a while back about AMD sponsored games don't seem to have the latest DLSS or DLSS frame generation in them. They just have FSR. That was a whole giant debacle that AMD never really quite denied, although then AMD's sponsored games after the backlash did start to seem to get updated with DLSS. Anyway, so the point is, are there agreements between GPU manufacturers and game devs? I would say absolutely yes. Now, probably putting some invisible bloat in their games just to tank frame rate and sell newer GPUs. Okay, that's where I think it's pushing things a little far, but not necessarily completely wrong. So invisible bloat just to tank frame rate. That's a bit extreme. I don't think it's exactly that. Although in the past, this was before my time as a tech YouTuber, but I remember being more just a tech consumer and PC gamer, seeing like back with I think back when Nvidia GPUs were like way better at tessellation than AMD GPUs were. There was some reports of some games having tessellation settings pushed up maybe higher than was reasonable to take frame rate on competing brands. You see what I'm saying? So sure, I think some stuff like that could go on, but I think more lately, the more obvious thing that would sort of align to this is those big RT heavy games, right? Those path tracing modes on Black Myth Wukong, Alan Wake 2, Cyberpunk 2077. Those are definitely tanking frame rates even on Nvidia hardware. But even more so on AMD hardware. But is that invisible bloat? That's where I don't feel like that's invisible bloat. There are visual differences between the full RT mode and the not full RT mode, especially in a game like Cyberpunk. I feel like the graphical fidelity of the full RT path tracing, RT overdrive mode, it's called in that game, is extremely transformative compared to the non-path trace mode in that game. In some of the other games, I feel like it's less transformative, but it's not invisible, and I don't think it's just to tank frame rate. I think, again, it is pushing a cutting-edge technology that does tank frame rate, but I don't think that's its sole purpose to exist. But is it there to sell newer GPUs? I'd argue yes. I think that is why Nvidia would partner with and develop those big, full RT modes. Would definitely be to sell new GPUs, because again, Nvidia's newer generations of products are better at ray tracing than their older generations. So if Nvidia's trying to get Nvidia users to upgrade to newer Nvidia products, you need to give them a game that doesn't run well on their older product, right? So I think that does make sense. But then also, why, if somebody's going to buy a new GPU, you need to create the reason to buy the Nvidia GPU rather than the AMD or Intel GPU, right? And realistically, AMD is the bigger competitor there. So with Nvidia having that ray tracing advantage in their hardware compared to their AMD competition, it makes sense for them to push big, heavy RT games, which make their GPUs stand out relatively in competition. So yeah, I think that is happening, but again, it's not just invisible bloat. There is an actual graphical feature there which does have graphical advantages despite tanking frame rate and especially doing it on the other's competition. Now, I also see some people talking about like NVIDIA's now purposely crippling the 4090 for the sake of wanting you to have a reason to buy the 5090. And I mean, if you look at something like Black Myth Wukong, if you're not using DLSS running at 23 FPS on the full RT mode at native 4K on a 4090, it certainly feels that way. Although you can definitely kick on some DLSS to get to a better point. Although even DLSS quality, we're only averaging 42 FPS on the 4090. But if you go all the way down to DLSS performance mode, we are now hitting that kind of 63 FPS-ish average. And then from there, you could kick on your, frame generation. Now I'm getting a YouTube ad on my own video. Are you kidding me, guys? Anyway, whatever. All right. So that's frustrating. I thought I had an ad blocker on. Did it get bypassed again by all the YouTube whatnots? Whatever. Anyway. So with the frame gen, okay, now we're at 99. But notice this. So to get this high-end NVIDIA GPU to run the high-end NVIDIA feature with the full path tracing, you have to use the other NVIDIA features, right? The DLSS and the frame generation and all of that in order to get those good, performance levels. So it kind of does all sort of tie in, although in the end you can end up getting a decent performance level on that 4090 in this hardware. Anyway, so that's that bit. Now, however, here's where I also need to comment on what video did this specific comment actually come from. This video was actually not about any of those big Nvidia path tracing games. This video was about Monster Hunter Wilds PC system requirements. We got Danielception going on here from that video here. Maybe we'll cover that up. I don't know. Anyway, the point is, so this game specifically, people are reacting to the fact that, man, you need a pretty beefy GPU and CPU to apparently just hit 30 frames per second, because that 60 is using frame generation. So you'd be at closer to a 30 FPS actual frame rate before then frame generation hitting 60, and we're only at medium settings, again, on fairly beefy hardware at 1080p. Oh, that feels pretty brutal. So this game in particular, as far as I can tell, doesn't seem to be one of those big, NVIDIA-sponsored, path tracing modes. We're talking about the medium graphics settings, right? So I think in general, when we're just getting into the other piece of this, which is, otherwise I can't explain anything. Graphics in games reached a peak in about 2015-16. I can't imagine a game more complex than Cyberpunk 2077 to run, yet somehow every next new released game, regardless of developer genre series, raises the bar for requirement in hardware. Okay, so this game in particular, I have some suspicions that this game is going to be heavily CPU limited based on the engine being similar to the engine used in Dragon's Dogma 2. I mean, it's the same engine. I don't know if it's the same version of the engine, but it's a Capcom developer. And Dragon's Dogma 2 could get seriously CPU bottlenecked, and one of the only ways to push through a CPU bottleneck is kind of to use frame generation, although coming from 30 FPS, that feels really bad. Anyway, so I would say that this game in particular doesn't give me any signs of this as, a mode being pushed by GPU manufacturers to kind of be in the secret agreement with game devs to sell the game. Also, I should push back also against these, okay, we have these path tracing modes in these other games, which, yes, I do think are implemented to try to sell you new GPU hardware. But you don't have to run the games at those settings, right? So like if I'm on Alan Wake 2, I could just turn honestly the 4060 Ti 16 gigabytes only hitting 34 FPS, and like, yeah, it's beating the 7800 XT by 54%, and that's doing worse, but neither of these are doing great. But again, you can just not use that big feature set. Even at 1440p high settings, we're doing a lot better, and then with like quality level upscaling, we're now hitting 60 FPS, well, 64 on the 4060 Ti and 94 on the 7800 XT, and now the 7800 XT is crushing the Nvidia competition. But the point isn't these specific GPUs and all that. The point is that when you have these big, heavy maximum settings added to games, you don't need to use them. Now, sure, it still creates that fear of missing out to sell you the new GPU hardware, but you can just turn it off, right? You can just go down to a lower graphics setting and oftentimes still reach good performance in a lot of games. There's scalability there. So in general, I don't actually have a big issue with there being some maximum graphic settings that are designed to completely push the boundaries of what is currently possible in real-time rendering, as long as the game still looks good on reduced graphic settings that people can run on realistic hardware. So if you want some crazy max setting mode to show off what a powerful GPU can do and sell new GPU hardware, again, I think it's kind of cool to see pushing the boundaries of tech. But if you have to offer that reduced graphic settings that run well. And like I said, the scary thing about the system requirements for Monster Hunter Wilds, which again, the game's not out yet, we don't actually know how it's going to perform, is that it's the medium graphic settings that appear to be kind of scary if you're needing frame generation to get past 30 FPS at 1080p medium on fairly reasonable, GPUs. Again, game's not out yet. We'll have to see what happens. So that's where I think it gets a little bit more brutal, but that's also where I feel like it's less of a collusion with GPU developers to try to sell you something. Because again, are there agreements between game devs and GPU manufacturers to implement technologies to sell you newer GPUs? Yes, but does a game developer want people to not be able to play their game without buying a new PC? No. Game development is incredibly expensive right now. We're actually in a bit of a crisis in the gaming industry right now, where a lot of games have massive budgets, especially these big AAA games, and then aren't necessarily selling massive copies. And that is because the amount of copies they need to sell to make up those budgets is astronomical. So we saw, for example, a game like Star Wars Outlaws came out recently, and I think it sold only 1 million copies total. And like 1 million copies, it just in and of itself, 1 million's a big number, right? But the amount it cost to develop that game is certainly not being covered by that 1 million copies, let alone trying to turn a profit on it, right? So in the end, it's not good for a game developer to limit who can buy their game. It's actually better for them if lots of people can buy their game, and that's going to be easier to do if more people can run it well on their PC. So in the end, I think the more reduced graphic settings, your medium settings, your low settings, game developers do in the end want those to run on as much hardware as possible. Given the amount of time they're allowed by the publisher, whoever, or financial constraints to optimize the game for that, right? So in the end, when we get these games so can we explain what's going on, right? Where they're like, I can't imagine a game more complex than Cyberpunk 2077 to run, yet somehow every next new release game, regardless of developer genre series, raises the bar for requirement hardware. So first of all, that's actually just still not quite true. Obviously, this is saying every next new game is a bit too much. Like if we look at some recent releases, like God of War Ragnarok just came out on PC, and while it has a couple of quirks, my testing of that game shows it actually running extremely well on a wide variety of hardware. Like there are still games coming out that run very well on a lot of hardware. But are there more and more games that are heavier and heavier to run? Especially, let's maybe compare to Cyberpunk 2077, since that was mentioned, but just in general. So what's going on? Well, I mean, one of the big things is that gaming consoles are the lead for game development. They're going to, again, like we said, game budgets are huge. They need to sell as many copies as possible. And quite frankly, it's going to be easier to sell a ton of copies on, consoles, maybe compared to just like focusing on PC so exclusively, right? So a lot of this outlook on things is very PC-centric, when most games actually aren't using PC as their lead development platform. They're using consoles, right? So I think base level of system requirements is often set by the base level of console hardware that they're targeting. And so for a game that's going to be like a PlayStation 5 exclusive, the PlayStation 5 is, it's not like an extreme high-end PC, but it's a lot more powerful than like PS4 level hardware, right? Cyberpunk 2077 famously kind of struggled and somewhat failed to be a cross-gen game. In other words, it was still trying to run on a PlayStation 4, not just exclusively developed around the PlayStation 5. And so a big issue here is that we got a new generation of consoles, which when you're still in the cross-gen period, didn't have as an extreme of an impact to the base level of hardware we're trying to target. But once you kind of leave the cross-gen period, where developers are targeting both the PS4 and the PS5, and now they're just targeting the PS5, now you have that the issue that some gaming PCs aren't quite up to the level of a PlayStation 5, and alternatively, some PC gamers aren't willing to accept the levels of performance that console games are maybe running at. Because a lot of times console games, a lot of PC gamers actually seem to have the impression that a PS5 is actually running games at 4K resolution and 60 frames per second a lot of the time. If you actually follow it closely, watch channels like Digital Foundry and stuff like that analyze console game performance quite a bit, oftentimes consoles are maybe, outputting a 4K image to a TV, but the internal rendering resolution is oftentimes sub 1080p, especially when they're trying to hit a 60 FPS mode. And a lot of PC gamers, I think are like 60 FPS is the bare minimum I would accept. I want 100 FPS. I want 120 FPS, right? And we were used to getting that, I think more in that cross-gen period and like when we were still at the tail end of the PS4 generation, where a gaming PC performance was so far ahead of a PS4 on a reasonable gaming PC that you just could get those crazy high frame rates pretty easily on the games that were targeting that level of hardware, right? And now, if a gaming PC, it's harder to just be absolutely crushing a PS5 spec right now. You might be better, but by how much? And if the PS5 game's running at like 30 to 40 FPS, right, then, are you getting to 60? Are you getting to 100? So that's part of it. Now, does that excuse it, right? Well, again, game developers are targeting the PS5 platform, and they have some amount of time to try to, optimize for PC and then for lower end PCs and things like that. But I think realistically, publishers are pushing them to get this thing out. How much time do they have for that, right? So every new game released, regardless of developer genre series, raised the bar for requirement hardware. Again, I think it has more to do with that shift in the baseline. But can't imagine a game more complex than Cyberpunk 2077 to run. So let's talk about that a little bit too, because it can be hard to tell like what is actually hard to run, like what makes a game hard to run. There's the graphic settings, there's what they're pushing there, right? There's how far down are you allowed to push the graphic settings, but there's also what's going on with the CPU, with data streaming. A lot of older games, especially again cross-gen games designed around still working on a PS4, a lot of times the amount of NPCs they'll put on screen is more limited, or the size of the areas you'll be in at one time is more limited. When we look at a game like God of War Ragnarok, which again runs really well on a lot of PCs, that was a cross-gen title. Honestly, it'd be interesting to see a game like that was designed for the PS5 and not the cross-gen, because when you're playing God of War Ragnarok, a lot of times you crawl through this little narrow space to give the game an older hardware like the PS4 time to load in the next area. And a lot of times you're only fighting a handful of enemies at a time, and then as you defeat some, more enemies spawn in, and then you fight them because of CPU constraints on that older hardware, right? So I think just in general, games are designed around a certain base level of hardware, and that moved up with the with the generational change. However, I do think that more console developers should make sure they're targeting at least running at 60 FPS at reasonable settings and resolutions on the PS5. Because that's where I think we run into issues like this, like we're seeing with the Monster Hunter Wilds PC system requirements. And again, the game's not out yet. We don't know how it's actually going to perform. But again, that's where this original comment that I'm responding to in this video is coming from. But it seems pretty clear from the preview footage we've seen of Monster Hunter Wilds that they're targeting 30 FPS on consoles. And honestly, a lot of the footage we've seen so far, and again, months out before the game launches, shows that they're not even always locking to 30 FPS on a PS5. So really, the performance of the game, especially on consoles, really comes down to what the developers are targeting. And a lot of games, if they're developed with originally a 30 FPS target on their console development, then they might try to shoehorn in a 60 FPS performance mode, but that usually comes at a massive hit to rendering resolution. And if the game's CPU-dependent systems, like AI and the amount of NPCs and all sorts of things, was designed around a 30 FPS target, sometimes there's just not enough headroom on that PS5 CPU to actually get to 60 FPS, no matter how far down you scale the resolution and the graphics settings. So really, I think it's important that game developers realize that I think most gamers, even on consoles, prefer the 60 FPS mode. Mark Cerny, when talking about the PlayStation 5 Pro, actually mentioned that, saying that I think it was somewhere around 70-something%, 75% of games, I don't have the article pulled up, of gamers on PlayStation 5 choose to play at the 60 FPS mode when it's available, even if it's not like the default mode available in the game. You have to actually intentionally switch to that. So in other words, I think it's important that game developers realize that a lot of people do value a performant game and aren't necessarily as interested in every visual boundary being pushed. And so I think we'll see less of these complaints and things like that if game developers do make sure that they're taking that into account. So I think is some responsibility here on game developers to make sure their game does perform well on reasonable hardware. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big deal for me, though, from the the commenter perspective, the consumer perspective, is that also make sure you're willing to run at optimized settings, right? Because a game having an extremely heavy, like full RT mode, doesn't necessarily mean the game's unoptimized. If you can run at more optimal settings extremely well on reasonable hardware. So, as the consumers of the games, I think what's fair for us is to acknowledge that you can turn down graphic settings and you don't have to chase those full RT modes and things like that, which I think it is fair to say are at least partially there to sell you newer GPUs, okay? But it doesn't mean the game's unoptimized. However, if we're getting games that, again, if this actually comes out, only running at 30 FPS on fairly tough hardware, maybe not even performing well on console, is it then fair to push back on game developers? I think absolutely. But in a lot of those cases, I think it isn't necessarily... so if the low-end settings aren't running well on reasonable hardware, I think that's more of a game developer issue and not a NVIDIA's trying to sell you something issue. I think that's more of those top-end specs, top-end settings where that's happening. Anyway, I know this was a bit of a different sort of video, but I see this kind of comment all the time, so I wanted to give my thoughts on it. Hopefully you guys found my thoughts useful and or interesting. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section here. And if you want to support what I do here on the channel, you can check out the join button down below to become a channel member. There's various advantages to that, including your comments being easier for me to see. YouTube automatically highlights those for creators and things like that. You get a little badge on your comment and stuff like that. So anyway, you can check out what's available down there, but totally understand if that doesn't work out for you financially. But either way, thank you to viewers, subscribers, commenters, everybody. I hope you all have an excellent day.